Hi there, my name is Teni Brant, and welcome to Speak Dicely, the podcast where I get together with other tabletop enthusiasts and we speak dicely together. In the first episode of this podcast, I was joined by some marvelous guests to talk about first-time experiences playing Dungeons & Dragons. This time, we're going to talk about the other side of the coin and talk about first-time experiences of Dungeon Masters. So joining me today are Logan Cracknell, Matt Costin, and Niki Degoey. Hey guys!
Hi.
Hello.
How's it going?
Oh, it's great. And an update for the listeners as well. The first two episodes were on location. I'm definitely going to be less echoey now because we are all in separate locations recording this over Discord.
Oh yeah, technology.
Wait, I'm not in the same room as you guys?
Hold on.
You lied to me.
Surprise.
But I can see all your faces. I don't understand.
Like right now, to me, Nikki's there's movement on your camera again. Like it kind of looks like a mosaic now.
Ooh. Well, you're not blinking for me anymore, so that's good.
Well, that's an improvement.
Yeah. Okay, because Matt and I are in this
technology.
We're in the same apartment, but just in different rooms. So why is Matt fine, but my internet is not fine? Very confusing.
So it's great to have you guys in here. Now, I say I bring tabletop enthusiasts onto this podcast, but this is unfortunately a kind of a bit of a pointed comment. Oh my gosh, Niki, your camera came fully back. And just in time, as I'm going to point a comment at you, you aren't. Would you call yourself a tabletop enthusiast, as I have previously described my guests?
Well, Denny, no, I wouldn't. I am. As you mentioned outside of this podcast, I am D&D adjacent, where I am dating someone, aka Matt, who loves D&D, and so I hear all about it all the time. So I know a lot about it, but I don't play myself. So there you go. Sorry, folks.
I was told that I would only be with enthusiasts. That was in my rider. That and red M&Ms.
Well, to be fair, Niki is an enthusiastic person, so I think that got her just past the line to make it onto this podcast.
I know about D&D, and I have enthusiasm for things, if that's what you're saying.
You've also run a game. So
that's true.
So naturally, I got confused, and I was like, Niki, you should come on the podcast.
Mm-hmm. I understand. I understand your confusion. It's all good.
And she's in red. I don't have red M&Ms. So, like, she's really filling both of the things I asked for.
It's true. I just really like to hear myself talk, and so I was so stoked to be on this podcast. We'll see what I can actually contribute, but it's fine.
Oh, I'm sure you guys are going to do just fine. So this group of people here, we're all friends. I adore these people, and so would you guys? Previously, I'd asked my guests like what they do, but and especially now at times, like we're not doing too much, or what you might identify yourself as a person might not necessarily be the work you do. So I want to instead ask you guys, what are you passionate about? Tell us who you are and what you like about life. Perhaps Logan, if you want to go first.
Sure. Yeah. So, when the world's actually turning and we're not all just stuck in our house, a lot of my free time is, not free time. I work in theater. I'm a lighting designer most of the time. Free time is usually spent with either miniature painting or D&Ding. The joy of the pandemic is really, I'm now in 3 D&D campaigns. Never in my life have I been in 3 D&D campaigns.
Yep. Well, thank you, Logan. And Logan's currently a DM for myself and Matt in another game that we're playing. So he's definitely a busy guy in that regard. Matt, would you like to give us a bit about you?
Yeah, I guess if I were to describe myself, I'd say I'm myself as a creative person. I like just making things in my spare time, be it wire sculptures or making games. I love coming up with campaign ideas and building encounters and all that kind of stuff. And I even like making weird games like GeoGuessr maps or weird BuzzFeed quizzes or just whatever fun stuff I can play with friends.
Oh, and GeoGuessr's a blast. Matt had there's this running joke in this group of friends that Matt created about like honey glazed ham. So to get on a completely irrelevant tangent, Matt, could you kind of describe what is GeoGuessr and what is this business with honey glazed ham?
Yeah, please describe it.
So GeoGuessr is a game where you essentially are dropped somewhere in Google Maps and you have a certain amount of time to figure out where in the world you are. So we had a running joke with a friend for his birthday where he was trying to find somewhere to eat and he asked for suggestions. And we were trying to like inception him into wanting to go to this one place, which is just the honey glazed ham outlet that was near the event. So that just became kind of a joke. And so I decided one time to make my own maps for GeoGuessr where each one starts you staring at some giant pig sculpture somewhere in the world. And you just have to figure out where it is.
Oh, it's so brilliant, so silly.
Weird.
Yeah. And I think this was just pure genius because really it worked.
Yeah.
But we never went to we didn't go to the ham place though, so I don't know.
Right? Wasn't it like
been going for years now?
Yeah, we had it so ready, and then at the time of the party, turns out party was at 2. Turns out the place closed at noon. So all of it was for nothing. As the one thing we didn't research was the hours of the store.
Oh, and Nikki, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Yeah. So that's like not what going very off of that. Kind of, I don't know. So I'm a freelance food photographer and graphic designer. So I love food, and I also am really, really passionate about travel, and I have a goal which I don't know if I'll be able to hit now from COVID times, but a goal to reach or to visit 30 countries before I turn 30. So I have 8 countries to go, but only 3 years to do it. So it's not looking good, but we'll see. We'll see. But yeah.
This year's definitely a wash for that goal.
Yeah,
now,
that's okay.
Could you just go to find the embassies of 30 countries and just run in and out, in and out, in and out?
Yeah, I'm gonna say no. But Matt had the idea of changing it to 40 countries before 40, and so it just ups the stakes, but also ups the years. But I don't know. We'll see. I'm still hopeful.
Yeah, in the stages of grief, there's a stage called negotiation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I'm at.
40 by 40, woo!
It doesn't have a good appeal to it as much. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I mean, you still got 3 years. Who knows what's gonna happen? Oh, I'm so excited to have you guys on here, and we've talked to people about playing D&D. We've talked about a bit about role playing, and the reason I got you 3 in here is because you have all either are or have been a DM, a dungeon master, for the listeners who aren't familiar with the acronyms of Dungeons and Dragons, or copyright game master instead of Dungeons and Dragons specific dungeon master. Don't come after me, Daddy D&D. So when and Nikki has already mentioned that she's kind of D&D adjacent, but when have you guys? When did you start playing tabletop role-playing games?
I started doing it in university, kind of a few years in. Kickoff for it was we had some friends got together to have a guys' night where we just played poker. And I think the entire time, somehow the conversation got onto Dungeons and Dragons, and we just talked about it for the whole time. So the next time we tried to have a guys' night, everyone's like, let's just do Dungeons and Dragons instead of poker, because that sounds more fun. And I think that first one was kind of a mess, but I got interested and got excited about it. That was with 4th edition, I believe, was what I started with. And then very quickly transitioned over to 5th edition because it came out shortly after we started. Logan here was actually the first DM I had.
Yeah. So I was the DM for the group of that guys' night.
This infamous guys' night.
Yeah, no, it was
The one time we did one.
the one time we did one, and our D&D wasn't. Our roommate Dallas straight up was like, if you guys keep talking about this in front of me, I have to be allowed to join. And we're like, okay. And so, but my first experience with a tabletop RPG was when I was 11, I want to say. And my dad was like, well, when I was 11, I learned how to play D&D. So here's all my books of like AD&D. Read them and then I'll run you through a campaign with you and your friends. And I was like, okay, I'll read all these books. I didn't read any of them. I just lied. I was like, yeah, I read the books. And my dad had to explain everything when we got to character creation. But no, it's I started with that, and then I played for a few months and dropped it throughout most of my life, and like from 11 till around 18. And then it was kind of the end of high school. The comic book shop that was across the street from my high school did once a week drop in, drop out D&D thing. And I went to buy some comic books and some manga. And I was like, oh, I love D&D. I remember it was so much fun. And it got me back into it. And thankfully, now it has just been such a huge part of my life.
Mm-hmm. So out of everybody I've interviewed so far, you're definitely the one who got started before I did, which was about 10 years ago. And also 4th edition. And unlike your dad, who was like, here is my supplies, I went to my parents, I'm going to go play D&D. And they went, oh, be careful. I heard children stab each other with swords. And I was like,
What?
well, I experienced the satanic panic in the 2000s.
Yeah, I had when I mentioned it to my parents, like after I played for the first time, my dad's like, "Oh yeah, I used to play all throughout high school." I'm like, "You've never once mentioned this to me in my entire life. You've ever played or know what Dungeons and Dragons is?"
Now I have a question for you, Denny. Though, so your parents said, "Oh, be careful. That's the game where kids stab each other with swords." But you didn't say they stopped you from playing it.
Wait a minute, the kids with swords or my parents?
No, your parents. Like, they're like, oh, here's this game where kids stab each other with swords. Oh, just be careful. Don't get stabbed.
Oh, I see. No, my parents are actually very lenient. Specifically, that was my stepmother who said that to me, and she is a bit of an older woman. So, yes, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Now that I know the history of D&D, that seems like the proper era, if you knew about it then, in the 80s, that is. And of course, I'm not from a religious family, so a lot of religious folk were concerned about D&D during that time. Nikki, so how long have you been playing tabletop role-playing games?
Well, actually, okay, so I was also in university with these peeps here, and remember that guys' night that I was not interested in, this infamous guys' night. But only after I like Matt and I have been dating for how long? Like a couple years or whatever. Where my youngest brother Nate, was getting into it, and so for his birthday I got him like all the books and stuff, and he had it for a while, and then he didn't have like a good friend group to play it with or something. So one time when Matt and I were over at my parents' house, he decided to run a quick session so Nate could experience it and like see how it was. So I played just like a one-off there, and that's basically it. That's the first thing. I played a one-off. I've been around it because like you guys play it so often, and like so I feel like I know like all the campaigns that you've played, I know about them because Matt just comes home and like tells me, oh, this time, like, Logan did this, or like Denny did this, and so I feel like I've just been encompassed in it for a while, but I've really only played that one shot. I've been a like side character, I think, for one session of a campaign where I was like an enemy or something like that, and then my own that I ran, which was also a one shot. So, but otherwise, not so much.
Yeah, with that one I ran for your brother, so you could get kind of like a taste of what D&D was like. We used some pre-made character sheets. So you picked one, your brother picked one, your dad who was playing with you also picked one. So we were going through, and he was doing a bunch of stuff, crazy. Like as we go along, we do a strength check. He's got really high strength. We do a dex check. He's got really high dex. He attacks with a battle axe one time. Then he uses a knife another time. And then I realized partway through that he just has all the leftover character sheets that no one picked. And whenever he was asked to do something, he'd just look at them to see which one had the highest stat and use that.
I forgot about that. That is my dad to a T. He'd like any game he can figure out how to cheat, he'll do that. And so
he just had them in a stack, and he'd just like flip them over until he had the one on top that had the best stats for what he was trying to do.
Wow.
Yeah, it checks out. Yeah.
Is that a form of power gaming?
Having 6 characters, I guess.
He's just 6 kobolds stacked on top of each other.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe you pulled that shit on me in that game. So kind of moving on to as I mentioned, you guys have all been and still are in some cases DMs. Do you guys kind of want to talk about your first games? And whoever would like to start on that, because I'll admit, I actually don't remember my first DMing experience. I've been thinking about this for days, and I'm like, I can remember the first time I played, my first character, but I can't remember what freaking time I DM'd.
Boy, can I remember the first time I DM'd? That was in first year of university for some of our friends. And oh boy, was it terrible. I don't know how any of us still decided to play D&D after that.
I heard stories about this.
It was just like, it was like some pre-written thing for 4th edition. I think everyone, like, we just came with like some pre-gen characters that came with it. Nothing made sense. Part of it's probably because like, I just read like the first bit because like it was super impulsive that we were all like, yeah, we want to play D&D. Let's try this. And it was just a big mess. And, you know, our friend Christy tried to tame some wolves, and it just went poorly. And at the end of that, I think we all were like, this was, we'll never do this again. But I did know, I was like, I know D&D can be great. I've played it many times where it was super fun. And then the first time that I would say was a real DM experience was with the group of us who in 3rd year started playing after that poker night. And it started with 4th edition. And after I think like 1 or 2 sessions of that, we just like totally changed over. We're like, oh, 5th edition's out. Let's just do this. This is new. There's way less things to read. And that went really well. I think, you know, there was a lot of learning. I think there were easily lots of mistakes that I made. Like if I could go back, I'd be like, oh boy, don't do this. Don't do that. You don't need to read the entirety of the Dragon Queen's Horde to DM all of one section of it. But it was like a great time after that very, very first one. The first one that like became a real DM player continuous experience. And yeah.
I have a question that maybe Denny you've covered in one of your videos or something like that. But can you guys explain to me the difference between like what did you say, like version 4 versus version 5? Like, is there like really every time they update it, is it really like a lot of updates? And like, is it annoying to relearn?
So in some editions of Dungeons and Dragons, essentially when these games go through a different edition, there is a change, usually quite dramatically, in the rules. In my experience, I only really know 3.5, 4th, and 5th edition, and 3.5 even less so. And Yes, I would say it's like trying to learn a different game with the same flavor. And the current edition, 5th edition, is one of the, unfortunately for those who might be intimidated by all the rules, is one of the easiest editions of Dungeons and Dragons to date to learn. 4th edition, where it kind of messed up was that it treated the game more like a game instead of like a role-playing game. Like, it was very focused on your character has powers they can activate, kind of like in a video game. You're just like, I play this card. This is my power card. Instead of being like, I flavor the attack of my sword in this way. This, like, you got less creativity out of it, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah, it
Weird.
felt like playing Warcraft 4th edition, like the very little I played of it.
Yeah, it felt more like going through the movements of mechanics as opposed to trying to make things your own.
But then at the same time, I feel like there's that, we get into now, it's like, oh, with 5th edition, sometimes you're sitting there being like, I miss when a fighter could do more than just attack.
Well, yeah, I say the fighter does have a lot of, that's a topic for a different thing. I play a lot of fighters, and there is a lot you can do. It's just not a lot when it doesn't come up as often.
And I would love to talk about classes with folks at some point. But right now, Matt, I want to get your first time DM story out of you.
Yeah, I remember mine really vividly. Mine was maybe just coming out of university, I think, was one of the first times I did it. I'd been playing for a few years and wanted to give it a shot because I'd had this story idea in my head and just like ideas for encounters, ideas for mysteries, all this kind of thing. And I just wanted to use those. So for me, I decided to make life easier for myself. I got a very small group together. I gave them the rule when making their characters that they can make whatever character they want as long as it was in the book and in their background, their characters were friends. I didn't want lone wolves. I didn't have to struggle to get everybody to like each other. It's my only rule. Like, your characters have to know each other and have to like each other. Yeah, for my first time, I probably put way more effort into it than necessary because a lot of stuff got scrapped. Because I fell into the trap originally of writing a story beat by beat. For the first session, at least. So, like, our first session was a murder mystery, and I had written out in my notes every decision I thought the players might make and how that would affect the story, and just like 1,000 branching paths. Even as I got along, I got a little better at just coming up with plot point scenarios and kind of improving with the players and then fitting those in when it felt natural to progress the plot, instead of trying to come up with a plot for everything they do. Just come up with points which I can fit into the different sections. I also, with that one, basically my whole premise with my first campaign was to try and keep the scale small to keep it manageable. I had a small world they were in. It was 4 towns they traveled between, a small group of players, and yeah, what I felt was a smaller story, just so things didn't get out of hand.
So, Nikki, as I mentioned, is also has some DM experience, but hers, I think, is perhaps one of the oddest out of all of our first time DMing experiences. Nikki, would you like to tell us a bit about your first time being a dungeon master?
Yeah, sure. So for all those listening who's like, okay, she's never played, why is she literally on this podcast? Well, I'll tell you that I have DM'd. So yeah, it is a really weird story. So basically, this was just this past like spring, this past June, where it was Matt's birthday, and what I wanted to do, because of the pandemic, we couldn't like all see each other or whatever, and so I wanted to do some sort of like online games night type of thing for Matt's birthday and like plan out this whole like thing I don't know that he really like. And so I mentioned in our like group chat about a month before his birthday in May, like, what should I do? And I think it was Logan actually who was like, we should play D&D, like you should DM a campaign. And then I was like, because I was thinking that a little bit, but because I had only literally played like one time, I was like, I don't know if that's gonna, I think that sounds fun. I think I really like that, but I don't know if I'd be able to actually do that. So if anyone can like help me with that. And then hero Teni helped me, was gracious enough to help me create this campaign. So basically, I wrote it wasn't a whole campaign, it was just a one shot, because otherwise that sounds insane. But I don't know how you guys do that. But yeah, so the theme, so basically this was all happening. I was at my parents' house and Matt was not there. And so as I mentioned, my brother Nate, like he is a big fan of D&D and he is also really into like creative writing. And so I asked his help as well, just like for writing the campaign. And together we thought of an idea to make it Animal Crossing themed, because that was the time when Animal Crossing was like super big. We were all playing it and I'm like, this sounds so fun. And so basically that night I went, my brother was playing Animal Crossing and I was in his room just like writing out this story for this one shot and like getting his ideas and bouncing them off. So I basically wrote the story all in one night. And I guess it's the same thing as what Matt just said about writing a story and like different, just all these different scenarios versus just like points. Cause I wrote like a literal story of what I wanted to happen. And then I looked at it and I was like, okay, I don't even know like where they like roll in this story. Cause I didn't know. I've never really played the game. I don't know. So I brought it to Teni and together over the course of the month, we just made it an actual playable game. And just so I was basically learning how to play D&D the same time as learning how to be a DM. So that was definitely super confusing. And Teni, you helped me out a lot. And for those who have not seen the beginner videos of Dicely, then just check those out, because that's where I would have gone anyway. But so we played the campaign, and this was all a surprise for Matt as well. So that was really fun. That we tricked Matt into thinking that that Teni was running the campaign, and he would tell me about it. And he'd be like, "Oh, he wants us all to be animals. I don't know why, and it's so weird." I'm like, "That is weird, super weird." And then the day came, and I was like, "Hey, guess what? It's my campaign. It's not Teni's campaign." And it was like, "What? Crazy." So it was an Animal Crossing campaign. All of the players were different animals, and Teni also made custom races. I guess that's what they're called, right? Of the different animals based off of the different villagers in Animal Crossing, and what animals that the players wanted to be, and then made all these stats. It was crazy. I just did the story part and tried to find all the enemies, and also I was learning how to use Roll20 at the same time. So it was it was fun. It was fun to write the campaign and make a whole story and everything, and but I don't know how you would do it for an entire multi-session campaign. That just sounds so hard. I don't understand. Matt was like, "Yeah, my campaign was small. It had 4 towns. Mine only had 1 town." So, and that was hard enough, and it took me literally a month to write. So, yeah.
Yeah. So my hand in that surprise. I kind of felt like it was suitable for me to get involved, for 2 reasons. It was a nice opportunity for me to practice home brewing, which is, for those who are less familiar with tabletop, is the process of creating original content that works within a specific game's rules. So, the D&D has races like elves, dwarves, etc. But for Nikki's Animal Crossing idea, I was like, well, I'm going to create deer villagers. I'm going to create goat villagers. And then, and another funny thing about that was because it was under the guise of I was running this thing for Matt's birthday. It was like, I'm going to choose an animal that I think represents each of you best. But really what I did was I asked everybody like aside and was like, what animal do you want to play as? And then Nikki like secretly found out what Matt's favorite animal was. And I just created that as a race.
I was just so sneaky, just like the whole month, because Matt had no idea.
I didn't suspect anything.
Yeah, and like I think that Denny, when you and I were talking about like what animal like that they should all be, and you said like, oh, maybe there's like a way to ask him sneakily, and then I literally, because we were playing Animal Crossing, I just turned to Matt and I was like, what kind of villager do you think you would want to be if like you were in Animal Crossing? He's like, oh, I think I'd like to be a goat. And I'm like, hey, and then I just texted Denny. He was like, oh, goat. There you go, we're done. But like the whole month, like, because Matt was running his own campaign, he'd be running, and then I'd just like come in and be just like ask questions, like just out of like curiosity's sake, and be and just be like, so what happens like with this, and like what happens? He's like, oh well, blah blah blah, and then like, and I think I told you that, Denny, that I was doing that, and you're like, won't that make him suspicious? I'm like, no, not at all. Like I have never shown any interest in playing myself, so it was it was a very sneaky time, but it was good. But a lot of like learning, definitely a lot of learning for me, because I was just very confused about just how the fighting worked and the stats of the characters, as well as like some of the monsters when I was trying to pick of like and like balancing them properly, versus like what level the characters were at versus what level the monsters were at, and making it like not too easy but also not too hard. And so that was fun too.
Mm-hmm. And in that session, a lot of first-time DMs won't have the luxury of this, but I kind of stuck around during that session after Nikki revealed to Matt that she was actually the DM. But like Nikki was saying, she was less familiar with the rules, so I kind of stuck around to help take on the referee rules role, I suppose, and let Nikki run her story as I just kind of watched, and it was a lot of fun.
And it was so helpful, like having you there and just like writing all those different races and stuff. It was crazy. But also like we were playing, like Logan was part of that campaign, and like we were playing with people who play a lot, and so they kind of understood the game and understood that it's my first time, and didn't do too many crazy things to like throw me off, because that was what I was most nervous about. 100% was like the improv part of being a DM, and I was just like afraid of like there was one part where they all went into the museum, and if like you're familiar with Animal Crossing, there's a museum and there's an owl that runs it, Blathers, and he's like such a cute game, right? And like so before the campaign started, because they had to get like a fish from the museum. And I was like, to Denny, I was like, so what if they try to kill Blathers? And he's like, I don't think they're going to do that. I'm like, I don't think they're going to do that either. Blathers is really cute. And like, they wouldn't want to do that. Literally the first thing they go in, and Logan's like, I stabbed Blathers. Like, I have nothing for this. I didn't prepare for this. So we had to do a bit of improv. Or I had to do a bit of improv, but I think it worked out, and it was
And I think in the end they kind of redacted that strategy. I don't think they actually. I think did you guys like end up knocking him out or something?
Yeah,
I think so.
Oh,
it was crazy just to like try to get them onto the point where I wanted them to go, but also try not to control them very much either. So yeah, definitely would take practice.
And that goes to show, I mean, like Nikki, who ran her first time, and me, who was assisting her with like more than 5 years of DMing experience, neither of us were able to predict that the players would treat poor Blathers in such a stupid way.
I know.
Blathers had it coming.
You guys are just monsters. He's so cute. Everyone loves Blathers. But no, let's stab him.
That's what we learned about that game. You're all monsters. Now that you guys have kind of run through your stories, I think I do have a bit of an inkling about my first time DMing, but I feel like it's more of a trace memory. Like I described my first time playing as an acid trip. And I feel like my first time DMing was similar because I just remember like I was in my living room. A few of my high school friends came over. We were running fourth edition. And I don't think any of the players I had with me that day were like seriously into playing. Like I think they just kind of wanted to hang out. So I remember one of them got up on a table and started dancing in the middle of the game. And that's what I remember about I think it was my first time DMing.
That sounds
And
intense.
that's probably why I don't remember it because I blacked it out. Yeah, it's hard to predict players as DMs, but I was definitely in the same boat as Matt and Nikki, where I was trying to prepare for every eventuality, because like you want everyone to have fun, and you think the way to do that is to make sure all the bases are covered, to be prepared for anything. But oh, my voice cracked there. But
Getting emotional.
yeah, it's too much. I can't be prepared for everything. But I've found over the years of being a DM that the best way, there are certain things that you should prepare that are hard to improvise. And I recommend the book by Sly Flourish for anybody interested in being a DM called oh dear, what is it? The Guide of the Lazy Dungeon Master. I'll look that up and give the proper title here soon. But anyway, essentially what this book describes is the summary of the book is, in the event that you've got an hour to prepare for a Dungeons and Dragons game, here are the things you can do with that hour to optimize your session. And reading this book recently, I'm going to carry that forward into more games because I've been a prep heavy DM and it sucks. But we'll come back to that in a bit. So before you guys played Dungeons and Dragons, though, Logan, you may not have an answer for this because you kind of started so young. What were your perceptions of D&D and tabletop games before you had a chance to experience them? And how have those perceptions changed since you ran a game, if at all?
Yeah, so for me, my view of Dungeons and Dragons up until like university was just seeing it on like TV shows, that kind of thing, where it's always treated as like this kind of joke. And from that, I've got the idea that it's just this absurdly complicated game. The people, like, it takes too much effort to learn to play, and it's just this mess of a game, which isn't super wrong. It is a lot. But yeah, I'd say once you kind of get over, or for me, once I got over like the initial learning curve, it's like learning a video game. You learn the mechanics, you learn the stuff within it. It's like any other game.
So I don't think I actually ever really heard about it until you guys started playing it in university. And I don't think I really had like a big opinion on it because yeah, it was starting to like show up on TV, like in like Community and a bit later Stranger Things, and like starting to gain some popularity. And so I never really knew enough about it to really give an opinion, I think, where I don't know, but like after hearing about it, I guess from Matt and from what the stories he would tell, like it sounded like it was fun, like, you know, the way that you guys talk about it, and like it's very creative and, you know, requires a lot of improv and things like that. And I think that the only, like, one of the main reasons why I don't play is because it just takes too long for me and I can't like keep my attention for that long. But after playing, I think that yeah, the same kind of thing that Matt says, that is, it's so much more complicated than I thought it was. And like there's so many things that doesn't mean that you can't play, or that should be like a deterrent for you to play, because, you know, so many people do. So it's clearly a learnable game. But like the fun part about it is that you can just be creative. Like I could make an Animal Crossing campaign, and it's just like a silly kind of fun thing that you can just cater to what your friends like and what you like. So I think that's like a really cool thing, is just like to show your creativity.
It's like another example of that. I'm running a Pokemon themed one right now, which is just slightly different rules, but also just you can kind of make whatever story you want with this game, which is cool.
Yeah, and as Denny said, I didn't have any preconceived notions of D&D. I was 11 years old, so I just got thrown into it. I was like, this is cool. My dad has this story of when I was like walking, he was like walking me to school with some of my friends after the weekend where I played D&D for the first time. And my friends were like, I was like telling them, I was like, oh yeah, like we played this really cool game called D&D. And they were like, oh, what type of video games? I was like, it's not a video game. They're like, oh, is it like Pokemon cards? And I was like, no, it's not like Pokemon cards. And they're like, is it a board game? And I was like, no, it's not a board game. And they're like, well then like, where are the graphics? And I was like, the graphics are in your mind. And that's still true. The graphics are in your mind.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. I think like my first preconception. Oh, hit my microphone. My first preconception of Dungeons and Dragons was from the Disney show Recess. There's like one episode where one of the kids like breaks his leg, so he ends up like going to the basement while everyone goes out to recess, and there's just a bunch of nerds downstairs in like wizard costumes, and they're like, hey, do you want to play Dungeons and Dragons? And I just kind of assumed it was like complicated chess with fantasy pieces.
Yeah.
But then I think the closest thing as far as like the mechanics go, when I was younger, definitely very into video games. And my brother and I found Star Wars Battlefront in a store. And we were like, oh, we want to buy this game, but we don't know what it's called. We never found out what the game was called at the time. So he kept buying Star Wars games, trying to find Star Wars Battlefront. And he found Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. And he's like, oh, this is really incorrect. And we were both like, okay, so we're going to ignore that one. And eventually I came back to it and I was like, no, this game is great. So my brother inadvertently got me into a game that kind of prepped me for Dungeons and Dragons rules. And eventually in high school, I found a group invited me to play Dungeons and Dragons. And then I was like, this is fantastic. And and I haven't turned back.
It's just incorrect in all the right ways.
That's right. It was a happy accident, as a Mr. Bob Ross would say.
On a side note, that old Battlefront game is an amazing game.
Oh,
I hope you found it at some point.
We did. We ended up playing Battlefront and got Battlefront 2. And love those games. Too bad the newer ones are EA affiliated.
Yeah,
not to be confused with Star Wars Battlefront and Battlefront 2.
Yes.
That's right.
Handle for Bikini Bottom.
Oh,
also
a great game. Yes. I love hearing these stories. So before we get into a new segment for this podcast, what lesson, if not from your first game at least, what lesson have you taken away from your experience as a dungeon master?
I think the biggest lesson I've taken away as, you know, someone who's been DMing for quite a few years now is you know, that as I think you and Matt and Nikki were kind of talking about this whole like really prepping things. The thing I've taken away is you don't need to prep a lot. You think you're playing maybe for a 4-hour session. Your players will probably for half of that talk amongst themselves, which is great. Like they will argue, they will debate, they will scheme, they will just have side things with themselves that you could never plan to prepare for. And so really it's like, okay, you cut that down to maybe 2 to 3 hours. Don't need to plan a lot of things. Just kind of get the points there and, you know, let the rest ride. Your players are going to be very forgiving of, you know, I think everyone feels that nervousness of if I make a mistake, if I misname someone and then name them something else later, my players will realize I'm making this up. And it's like, players know that you're making this up. We're all making this up. So like people will forget the small details. If inconsistencies happen, most of them will get ignored, and just like, be looser with the prep is the big thing I've taken away.
On that note, though, I will say I learned also, like, with inconsistencies, you can have inconsistencies in the story and this and that, but I found it was really helpful to be consistent in the calls I made as the DM. So if I decided, like, sure, fire can hurt these kind of monsters, I'll just make a note of that so that later on, if it comes up, like, no, I made that call, we're going to stick with it. Even if it's not in the rules or something bad has happened, we're just going to go with it because, yeah, I said that was happening. It's going to be weird if I keep flipping and flopping on what people can and can't do. Like for me too, a couple of the big things I learned going into this learned from DMing the first time. The DM screen is your friend. A lot of people think like, oh, the DM can cheat behind the screen, and you can. You shouldn't, but it is possible. Like I had a lot of trouble early on balancing encounters. Like Niki did, like, is it too easy? Is it too hard? And sometimes I'll set up an encounter and turn 1, the monster's at 2 HP left. So I'll just be like, all right, these monsters have a little bit more health just to make this last a little bit longer. Or like, I think the biggest one was the first boss fight I ever had. They roll into the fight, the guy attacks, almost kills somebody in one hit. I grossly overestimated how durable my players were. So all I did was change the dice he used. His attacks were 1d6. I changed that to 1d4 from that point on. I didn't fake the rolls. I just made it so he rolled a smaller dice. The players didn't know that. They didn't have to know that one, but it was just to make it more of a fair fight. And so I could adjust it on the fly to make sure it was more enjoyable, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah, that's something I fully agree with. Like the, you most of the time when you run an encounter, it's your first time that you're ever going to run that encounter. You might have grossly underestimated or overestimated the capabilities of that monster. It might do nothing, which is boring for the players. It might absolutely wreck. And I think as the DM, getting hung up on that idea that, oh, everything must be perfectly to the rules, I think it's more important to err on the side of this should be a fun experience for the players and yourself. Yeah. And like, if that means, like as you did, changing the damage die, sometimes I'll do like halfway through the encounter, the AC's lower, or maybe they're hitting with a lower die because they're weaker. Yeah, you can even thematically in story do that. Be like, it's getting tired, it doesn't hit as hard, or that kind of thing. And I find too, especially for your first campaign, don't be afraid to put restrictions on it. That sounds like mean, but like, for example, what I did where your background, you have to be friends. It just made it a lot easier for the first campaign, not having to deal with everyone's character against each other. Or a big one I used on my first one was no homebrew stuff. I wanted to go by the rules because I knew that was more balanced. It would make it a little easier for that first run if I didn't have to deal with like these variables I didn't know anything about.
I think my kind of learning, and I kind of touched on this already, but it was just like, you can be as creative as you want and you can do it for your own style. So like, even afterwards, after we played, like, so for example, like the way I used Roll20 is that I didn't have maps. I just had like pictures of, like, for example, if they go into the shop and then they see, the 2 shopkeepers in there instead of like an actual map. And so it wasn't like the quote unquote right way to use Roll20, but like for me, as being like a really kind of visual person, it made the most sense to me, and that's just kind of how I built it, and that's how like I wanted them to see what I was seeing in my head, kind of thing. And even like learning as well as just like what kind of campaigns you can make. And like for me, I'm not super into like fantasy stuff, and so I made an Animal Crossing campaign, and you can make a campaign where it's like you and your friends at the mall. Like, you know, like it doesn't necessarily, you can use elements from the different stats of monsters and things like that. And I think that's what I did. And I just changed the name of them, or like changed what they were, but used the exact same stats. And so just kind of melding it all together and making sure that it works. So you can really just like put your own spin on it, even if you're not into like the traditional D&D kind of aesthetic and vibe. And then the other thing, just to plug you again, Denny, I learned that Denny is very knowledgeable about this, and I'm just like stoked that you're starting this channel, because it's a great idea, and you really helped me. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate that compliment. So if you haven't checked out the introductory series, please head on over to that series on the YouTube channel and learn a bit about the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Anyway.
Do it!
So, like I mentioned, I don't really remember my first Dungeon Master experience, but something I've learned over the years, and this is more of a note on time, because Dungeons and Dragons is a play session will eat a few hours, and it will usually eat more time than you'd anticipated. For Dungeon Masters, consider, in this moment, does a player need to roll something in order to succeed, such as opening a door? Does a player need to roll to do that? Pick and choose your roll moments, because every roll a player has to make adds time to the game and will slow it down. So if it seems mundane, or if the character that player is playing is a character whose backstory suggests that they would be a professional at that task, perhaps let them remain a professional and don't give them the opportunity to fail on that. I know I had a bit of a regret on something like that on a player that played with me when we were doing like 10 people. This was a huge game, and Matt was there, Logan was there, and along with a bunch of people. And my friend Adam Brewer, he created this mercenary bounty hunter character who was really like the Mandalorian. He was this stoic, like supposed to be a professional type character. And in the end, he ended up getting stampeded by goats because I thought the comedic effect was more important. But I think I might have made that character a bit soured in his eyes. Thankfully, it was only a one shot, so he didn't have to stick with that character. But that was kind of something I thought about after the fact.
A big thing for me is I get very like nervous talking in front of a crowd and that kind of thing. So one of the things I was really worried about going into DMing is I've played mostly with Logan, who's a great DM, but he does a lot of voices for his characters and really goes into the conversation between the NPCs and the player characters. And that makes me super nervous. And I can't even do a funny voice for my own character in front of my friends because I feel uncomfortable. So I found it was totally okay to do a lot of my conversations from a third person perspective. That really helped me get over that. Where I kind of, instead of like talking as me saying, I'll be like, yeah, this person says this and this to you. I found like that can be a really good way to help me get over the nerves of trying to improv conversations between people. So I kind of take myself one step back out of it.
I think that's a good point of like, you can just play however you want, right? However makes you comfortable. And that's like the beauty of the game, is that you can just do it whatever, versus like a board game or whatever where you'd have like one way of playing, but like you can just do whatever you want, do whatever makes you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What makes you feel comfortable, what helps you have a good time playing. These are important things in order to play Dungeons and Dragons, because in the end, if you're not having fun, why bother? It's going to eat a lot of hours.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, you're going to do something for 4 hours a day every week, maybe. You want to be having fun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, in that vein is also like, if something isn't making you have fun, they're your friends at the table. Talk about it. Like,
yeah.
if you're like, oh, I really didn't enjoy this session where it was just combat after combat after combat after combat, maybe other people felt the same way, or, maybe there's a way to something that would make it more fun for you. And yeah, just everyone should enjoy themselves.
Yeah, and just sitting silently and ranting to yourself about it isn't going to help solve that. It's better. It's a group activity. You can talk to each other and make it enjoyable for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And so remember you're playing with your friends, whether it's all of your first time, then you're all in the same boat, or it's your first time and everybody else's experience like it was for me. And I knew that because they're my friends, I knew that they weren't gonna make me feel super uncomfortable and really allowed me to kind of take my time. And even if it was kind of awkward, they still understood that it was my first time doing this. So that's what it's all about, having fun, having a good time.
And what we've learned is Nikki wasn't uncomfortable with us trying to murder Blathers.
I was uncomfortable. What do you mean? That made me very sad.
We would have never seen that coming.
No.
And Logan, because you mentioned it, after a game session, just talking about things you liked or didn't like, I have another point kind of on attached to that, because me as a DM, I will admit I have a bit of an imposter syndrome, despite my players telling me that I'm doing a good job, or the fact that I know these rules. I don't think that makes me a good DM by nature. So after a session, I usually, just out of pure nervousness, I'll ask my players, did you guys have fun? What kind of stuck with you from this session? And getting that feedback, I think, at least helps me, a nervous DM, to make sure that I'm on the right track, or if they do have a critique about how that session went, I can make sure to try and change it. Because I remember one of the first campaigns I ran in 5th edition, there was one night where I was walking home from from my place to somewhere at the university with a couple of the players that were playing with me. And I remember them saying to me on that walk, they're like, no combat happened in that session at all, but that was a superb session. I was like, thank God. I was incredibly worried because I thought you guys wanted to fight something. So since then, I've made sure to to tune in and be like, what did you guys like? What didn't you like? Is everyone having fun?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've definitely done debriefs as well.
You should have just put Blathers in the campaign, then they would have fought it no matter what. And they see that owl and they're like, I gotta stab that thing.
That owl's dead.
He's got a stabbable face. You see his face and you're like, I could put a knife in there.
He wears a little bow tie. How can
Yeah, I agree with Denny that especially if you're doing something new in a session, like trying some new stuff, ask your players afterwards that they liked it. Like when I put a chase scene in a thing for the first time, or did a mystery of some kind, I asked afterwards, do you like the mystery stuff? Do you not like it? Do you want more puzzles, less puzzles? And just kind of get the handle on what they enjoyed in those, or if they even liked it at all.
I thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast. I love talking this stuff. You guys are a blast to talk with. But how's about we move on to something fun here for all of us here on the podcast currently?
Sure.
Sounds good.
Unfortunate to my previous guests, I didn't quite have this segment fleshed out by the time that we started recording, but I want to start playing some games with my guests on these podcasts. And so my guests today have chosen to create a story with me, with you. However, we're going to fill in the blanks because this is Mad Venture Libs. Okay, guys. So you guys are familiar with Mad Libs, right?
Yes.
Never heard of them.
Right.
Yeah, I know.
Right. Thank you, Logan, for prompting me. So what's going to happen here is I have created a story, but there are blanks in the story. I'm going to be asking you guys for adjectives, nouns, etc. And once these blanks are filled in by you guys, and you guys can figure out amongst yourselves what word should fill that space, I will read to you the story that we've created here. Whenever you guys are ready, I'll try and get through this as quick as I can. I'm going to type everything, so we'll be. All right.
Sounds good.
So the first thing we need is an adjective.
Slimy.
Slimy, great. A plural noun.
Slimes.
But
All right, deliberate.
what did you say, Matt?
I said slimes.
Wait, what did you
Oh.
say, Nikki?
I said butts.
Oh, I like butts.
All right. Logan has broken the tie. We need a place.
Detroit.
Detroit. All right. I need another noun.
Excalibur.
Okay.
Craig.
I was going to say Craig.
Deliberate. Do you contest?
No,
No,
I say we go
Excalibur.
with Craig.
Oh, Craig?
Oh.
All right.
It's unanimous. Okay, so that's going to be a bit of an inside joke for the listeners out there. Craig is a bot that I'm currently using to record all of us off of Discord. So a little insight as to the functioning of this podcast.
Nah.
All right, you guys ready for? Oh, sorry, a bad superpower.
Oh, you can only jump 20 feet in the air. No higher, no lower.
You have to write all of that out.
I will make it work.
20 feet in the air, man.
No higher or lower. Fantastic. A noun.
Whichever of the two we didn't use for the last one, be it Craig or Excalibur.
Or just Craig again. It's fine.
I suppose I should say plural noun. This should have been.
Oh,
My bad.
Excalibur.
Craig's.
Well, we. So Excalibur's then?
Excaliburs.
Yeah. Makes sense.
That's what Excalibur is known for, being many.
That's right. You know all the famous kings of England.
Mhm.
An occupation.
King.
Supreme ruler.
Ooh, I like supreme ruler. Okay. A verb ending in ing.
Dancing.
That was not
That's
my
much more
first thought.
PG than what I was thinking. So
Yeah, me too. I was like,
yeah.
huh.
Also, I don't know if I mentioned this to you guys, but you this podcast is allowed to cuss. I don't mind.
Oh,
Okay,
I've
so
been-
guess which one of us used to teach kids?
Yep, that's right.
Tickly.
Adjective.
Glazed.
Cute. I like
Wow.
glazed better.
glazed.
All right. A noun. We're almost there.
Fire.
Fire.
No.
Fire.
Oh, hey.
Fire's
Oh.
good.
Do you contest?
No, I'm fine with fire. I want to know what glazed fire is.
Oh dear. I need an event.
Armageddon.
Armageddon.
Is that an event?
Yes, I think that'll fill the need. So, adjective.
Hard.
Okay, a type of hobbyist, plural.
A botanist.
So botanist.
Tabletop RPGers.
Tabletop RPGers. That's actually. I feel that's
LARPers.
appropriate.
Yeah.
LARPers.
Let's go one
LARPers.
step further.
Do we contest? What is the decision?
LARPers.
I like LARPers? Okay.
Ooh, LARPers. An occupation again. This is the second last one.
Professional LARPer.
Wow. Does the party contest?
Nope. I love redundancy in these. It never works. It's
Amazing.
always great.
All right. And then an adjective ending in ly.
Sexily.
Oh,
Now we get.
Wow. I don't think is that a word?
Softly.
Sexily? Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, I guess that works.
yeah.
You just told me that I didn't have to be PG, so I was like, let me get at least one thing in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, it couldn't be fuckly, am I right?
That doesn't make sense, Denny.
Yeah, I know. I questioned sexily, but here I am. All right, are you guys ready to hear the story you've created?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Unbelievably so.
All right, I'm just gonna take a drink of water before I begin to narrate this work of art you've created. I see we're all taking a drink of water.
It reminded me I was thirsty.
Anticipation.
All right. Our story begins with our band of heroes. the Slimy Butts. Venturing
Ew.
into dark Detroit, they are in search of a mystical Craig, said to grant the wielder the gift of jumping 20 feet in the air, no higher or lower. Wary of potential Excaliburs inside, the party's supreme ruler leads the way. Very fitting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dancing their way through the glazed Detroit, they find the mystical Craig. But it is guarded by a ferocious fire. A harrowing Armageddon takes place.
Explains
Guys,
why it's on fire.
We ruined Detroit.
And Craig.
Nah, this is basically how Detroit is now. This is Detroit's backstory. Sorry.
Shots fired. Rude.
Apologies to all our listeners in Detroit.
That's right. But in the end, the fire is no match against the party of hard LARPers. Wow. That
I guess I didn't
worked
need
out too.
sexily in there because that definitely isn't PG.
Nope. Wow. Okay. The rewards came at a cost as they lost their beloved professional LARPer in the Armageddon.
Damn.
This was the story of the Slimy Butts, and they lived sexily ever after.
As slimy butts do.
Nice.
Oh
I
man.
like the idea that something's guarded by fire. It's not. It's just on fire. It's just burning.
Poor Craig.
Yeah, the implication is Craig is on fire. You guys did nothing.
We walk into a room. It's full of swords lying on the ground, and Craig's just burning in the back. And we're like, let's act this out.
Wait, let's act this out.
Let role play with me for a second here.
Yeah.
Oh
Craig's
my.
like, help me.
They're just
Oh.
throwing beanbags at him, being like, "Fireball, fireball!"
Oh,
It's only
that's a
making the
Logan
fire
strat.
stronger as your fireballs ignite.
There's another
Oh.
problem that a
Burn.
good fireball can't solve.
Raise your hand if you, as a DM, have been personally victimized by fireball.
Actually, no.
I was like, you guys don't take AoE spells, is what I learned last campaign.
Yeah,
I was a gunslinger.
I had an AOE.
Yeah,
It's
true.
just terrible.
That's true. You had light fireball.
Yeah, it did significantly less damage. I got it like level 20.
Logan destroyed a dungeon of mine with fireball.
Yeah, that was a good
I'm still
time for
wondering
me.
what AoE means.
Ah,
Area of effect.
that's right. Area of effect.
There you go. I was thinking all over everything.
Basically
you know
the
what?
same.
That's right. That works too.
Creativity, people. That's what you get out of this.
So this brings us to my next segment for this podcast. This is the part where I take in a question from the audience, listeners at home. And this is Question Dicely. So we still don't have any listeners yet. So the emailed question that I've received is from a friend of mine who, this was actually such a nice interaction. They messaged me last night with a question, and I hadn't spoken to them in years. And I guess they started playing D&D in the last couple of years, and I was quite surprised to find this out. And we just had a lovely conversation. But now,
Awesome.
I've got a question for you guys. Which do you find easier to DM? A published campaign or a custom one that you can improv with? This question was sent in by Samantha Hames. Wow, we also had a conversation how I wasn't going to mess people's names up, and I messed her name up. Samantha Haynes, you can follow her on Instagram at Sam L. Haynes.
Well, here, I could start. What do I find easier to DM? Both, neither, is the messy answer that I can give. I think I prefer a custom campaign 9 times out of 10, but I often will read things and take them from pre-written things. So, right now I'm running a campaign that Matt and Denny are in, and, we're in a winter town. adapted so many things from the Icewind Dale adventure that just came out. But at the same time, I like the overall, big things that are coming up are all going to be unique to this. As unique as anything that I find IDM is, which often is, I'm really into something, and that has either subconsciously or actively been influencing my thing that I've written as a DM. I would say for any new DM out there, I highly recommend going with a published campaign for your first time. Don't necessarily do the whole thing. You don't need to pick up Curse of Strahd that can last for, months, depending on how often you play. There's lovely ones that are maybe meant for 2 to 3 levels. Just dabble with that. They're easy to get through, and it gets everyone's feet wet, and it can be a super fun, fantastic time.
Yeah, for me, I've never actually run a pre-written campaign myself. All the ones I've done, I've made up, but I have done what Logan's done, where I've taken things from pre-written campaigns. Like for my first one, I was trying to figure out how to build kind of boss monsters. So what I did was I looked through a campaign that had the characters at a similar level, and I looked at what they made for a final boss for theirs, and kind of reworked that into something I could use. I've looked up campaigns to see how they plot out certain things. So they're even if you don't want to use one, they are an excellent resource to figuring out how to build your own. And I think it really comes down to how much you like storytelling. If you like being able to write your own characters, your own world, you're usually going to gravitate and have more fun running your own story, as opposed to one where you're running essentially someone else's story. But if you prefer more the mechanics of being a DM as opposed to the storytelling of it, like you like running monsters, you like interacting with the players more, but you don't like having to come up with a story to do that, or you have trouble improvising on the fly, pre-written campaign can be super fun for you to run and super handy as well. Also, there's room to improvise in a pre-written campaign. You can obviously go off the rails with it. You aren't glued to what happens in the book. If things start taking a turn, you feel free to go on that turn. You can homebrew it from there or find a way to pull it back to the story later. It's not like you're glued to it.
Yeah. And obviously, I've only ran one campaign that I wrote myself, but I think that if I had the choice, I would go with writing my own. Just because for me, the way that I learn is by doing. So I feel like it would be a lot harder for me to read a campaign that's already written and figure that out versus just writing my own, and then you can make it more custom and more custom to the players that you're playing with too. But yeah, I think it's to each their own.
Mm-hmm. And everything, anything that I really was going to touch on, you guys have covered. I think the only thing I would add to that is, in the event that you're a group of friends who've never played a tabletop role-playing game before, and one of you is forced to become the dungeon master, this is a perfect example where you'd probably want to run a published campaign. In addition to having to try and learn the rules, how to run a game, this will at least take having to create a story off of your plate. And I agree with a lot of these sentiments too. I personally prefer to run games in settings that I've created myself. I also take elements from pre-published campaigns, whether it is elements of a story that I liked, or a specific monster that I was I think that still would be a fun experience, but I don't want to run that whole campaign for that one thing. These are all excellent examples of kind of choosing your battle. So essentially, I guess we boil it down to, if you're newer, we recommend trying a published campaign, but if you've got the guts and the moxie, heck, might as well run your own.
I will say on that note, especially as a newer DM, if you are making your own world and your own stories, your own characters, try not to fall into the trap of making your story and your character is the most important thing. Like it's no fun for someone to come and listen to you tell a story about how great your character is that you made up while the players sit around and do nothing. So you got to make sure it's still, your world is open enough and not fleshed out to the point where there's nothing for the characters to do and contribute. Or nothing for the players, sorry, to do and contribute.
One thing that, like, Denny, I remember you saying to me, like, while I was writing mine, is that you're not, as a DM, your job is not to write a story, it's to build a world. And so, like, to me, that is very confusing, and I don't, like, or I know what you mean, but, like, it's very, like, I don't know if I can do that. But I think that it's, like, really good advice just for someone who is new and trying to, like, make their own, is that you gotta be prepared for anything.
Sure, that's a grain of wisdom for those who can use it. And Nikki, I'm sure it may not work for you specifically, but you'll learn how you DM, and if you end up playing with people again, they'll learn how you DM, and you guys will be a cohesive unit because that is the group you play with, and that is the game you understand.
Yeah,
It's true.
Yeah, you adapt to each other.
With the like first time making something, I mean that can get into a whole other podcast topic of campaign building, but I would say you don't need every answer.
Yeah.
Start small. You know, you can have a small town last for many sessions, and that doesn't make you feel like you need to like know then the intricacies of the monarchy that's like in the capital ways away.
Yeah. If they're never going to see it, you don't need to come up with it. Like, yeah, if you build an entire nation with all their structures and stuff, but your game takes place in roughly 2 towns, you don't need to super flesh out the stuff that's not in those towns.
And I don't know why that reminded me, but I did look up the book I was talking about earlier, The Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. That's what it was called, published by Sly Flourish. Yeah, if you're looking to hone down your prep time, I recommend checking out that book. And that brings me to, I've actually got a second question, which I wasn't planning on having a second question, but I just got sent this one before we started recording. I was like, this one is too on point to not include. So we touched on this a little bit, but how much did you over prepare? This question was brought to us by Ryan Worster, friend of the channel here. And you can find him over at the YouTube channel, The Fantastic Fiend. I can tell I over-prepared so much.
I think I did as well. There was like a whole part where I wanted you guys to actually go, sort of, and it like didn't happen at all. So I think I definitely like, but that's just like also my personality is just like preparing, and I really like to do prep stuff. But definitely like, it took a month to do one session for me, and I think that's probably a bit too much.
For my first one, I definitely over-prepared a lot, but in like weird ways. Part of it was good, where I fleshed out kind of the points along the story that I wanted to happen. So like, here are all the major beats I want, and here's the conclusion I'm leaning towards. Because it made it so I didn't have to prepare as much later on. But I prepared way too much for that first session, where I came up, it was a murder mystery. They had to find a serial killer in the first town. I had like 7 outcomes for how they find him and what happens when they find him in the different places. And even then, like, I still had to improvise. It didn't matter because the players made choices I wasn't ready for. Like, a couple examples, I built out everything, but I only wrote names for key characters, like, that I figured they'd interact with. And I'm bad with names in general, but the minute there's like a guy who, for me, is just nameless bystander who does this, they're like, "What's your name?" To him, I'm just stuck. I'm like, "Oh, I didn't write names for anybody who wasn't like the key figures in this story. I have to come for those." And Logan was in that campaign, actually. And he played not necessarily a pacifist, but he played someone who was really big on healing and saving lives. So there were times where they'd prioritize helping a person over solving the clue or chasing the villain. And I wasn't ready for them to not chase the villain. So all my preparedness kind of went out the window the minute a player makes a decision you're not ready for. So yeah, had to improvise anyway.
In line with I'll talk about this in a bit because it doesn't answer the question, but it's in line with improvising stuff. But for my first how much did I over prepare? The very first time I DM'd, I under prepared. That was the session I ran in first year that went terribly, and we all kind of left that being like, well, I don't know if I ever want to play D&D again. And then once I got to, really DMing, I think it started with a lot of over preparing, 5th edition, reading the entirety of Horde of the Dragon Queen. And in that campaign, we never made it past the first town area because after 2 sessions, we homebrewed everything and just went off the rails and said, goodbye, Horde of the Dragon Queen. Tiamat, she can destroy the world. We'll do something else. But in terms of that having to improvise, and this is the campaign I just finished that Denny and Matt had both been players in. I ended a session at one point being like, hey, so there's some choices. Where do you guys plan to go next? And everyone was like, the Fire Temple. And I was like, cool. They're going to go after the treasure. I don't even think you knew it was a temple at that point. You're like, the treasure. I was like, cool. Got stuff around the treasure. And then 2 weeks later when we came back, someone was like, I think it was Michael was like, I want to go to, there's a water temple I know about for my druid thing here. And I'm like, I have nothing prepared for this. Absolutely nothing. I open up I have a folder of just maps. And I pull in a map that's waterish, throw it into Roll20, build some walls as everyone's talking and doing things. And this is why your players will have hours in the campaign, the session, where they'll just talk. And that is great time to be like, oh, they're doing a choice I'm not ready for. Let me just figure some stuff out through some monsters. I knew, plot-wise things that were related to it. But in terms of the mechanics and playing in that space, I was like, I'm not ready. Thankfully, I got the opportunity mid-session to throw that together as they dealt with other things. But I do think with improvising, sometimes it's fine to also be like, hey, everyone, can we just half-hour break? Let's, get some food, get a drink. I need to just do a little bit of prep because we're going in a different direction.
Yeah. One thing I did, which is part of over-prepping for the first session, but helped me out later, is I built a bunch of random encounters that could just take place anywhere. So if they went somewhere I wasn't ready for, I just went to my folder. I'm like, this one fits. They'll pass through a farm village, and I can do this here. Or I just had a couple just generic kind of scenarios I could kind of plug in and shape them to whatever direction they were going in, which I found helped out a lot. Just have a couple things in my back pocket that I can use when needed, when I haven't prepared for that scenario or that section of the world or that decision yet.
Mm-hmm. My over preparedness is kind of at least one experience is similar to the story Logan was talking about, where one of the first games I ran in 5th edition when it came out, I think we had about 5 or 6 players, and I prepped just a typical dungeon crawl. For those who are less familiar, it's just an adventure where a party goes into an enclosed space, a dungeon, and they go in there, explore the space, defeat any monsters they find, gather any treasure they find. And they got through it real quick. And I was less prepared with the story element of it. So I was like, all right, I would like an hour break so I can write, similar to how Nikki approached her Animal Crossing story. This is what I was doing back then. I want to write how this is going to go. So everyone else broke for dinner, and I wrote how the next half of the dungeon was going to work. I do that. I don't do that anymore. I've allowed myself more freedom since then. Some things I do find are important to prepare are, like Matt was saying, a list of names. I like having a list of names that if the party goes, what's this guy's name? And he's a nobody to me, I could just cross it off the list of names and go, this is Gregory Tybalt. He's the local barkeep. That wasn't even a very inspired name. That was an improv name. But yeah, I get a list of more fantasy oriented names if that's the kind of game I'm playing, and I'll just kind of cross them off the list, and I'll make a note of that's who that person is now, without delving too deeply into them. And one thing I still find myself over preparing is maps. I love drawing my own maps, and I don't see myself stopping doing so. Unfortunately, it will eat up a lot of my time to keep doing so, but I love drawing geographic locations so much. I wouldn't cut it out of my process. I will make the time to make sure that I have maps that I can draw.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed that part too. Just like building an area for them to explore.
And at some point, I think Matt would like to join me in talking about building an encounter, and the environment is so important for that element.
Oh, I would love to do that.
Yeah, no, making battle maps are one of my favorite things. And I've started getting really into that. And I don't think it's one of those things that I would, if I'm rushed for time, it's like, oh, I still want to do that. Because as the DM, it's like, you're a player too. And it needs to be fun for you.
Yeah.
Well, I think that about brings us to the end of this podcast. So I'd like to thank all of my guests greatly for joining me on this episode, talking about our first time DM experiences. Do you have anything you'd like to plug? Perhaps we'll start with Logan.
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. There'll be some stuff in hopefully a month or so on that and Twitch. Twitch is where I mostly do a lot of my content and stuff. At LCKraken. Super easy to remember. It's just my initials and then Kraken at the end.
I can go next, I guess. You can find me on Instagram. Mostly I post food photography and stuff, which is exciting. It's just my first and last name. I assume Denny will write that down somewhere, or should I spell it?
There will be links in the description for sure.
Okay, cool. Otherwise, I have a baking show called A Very Awkward Baking Show. It's on YouTube, and it is where I try to bake things that are too hard for me, and comedy ensues. So you can find that on YouTube, A Very Awkward Baking Show.
And I don't have a huge internet online presence, but I do have a gaming channel that Nikki and I did called Level Up, where we play games that I know about and she doesn't, but she plays them and I try and talk her through them.
It's fun.
Yeah. I haven't posted in a while, but I might be uploading some more Echo the Dolphin gameplay soon.
Yes.
Ooh. They're a very adorable couple. If you haven't seen them Let's Play, I recommend it. Back when I was doing a Let's Play as well, me and my co-host also joined them on their channel. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be finishing that game, but that was fun. But and for those of you who are listening to this on YouTube, you can find the link to each of their YouTube channels on the main page of the Dicely channel here. They'll be in the Dice Friends category of our homepage. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming in. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you for having us.
Had a great time.
Yeah.
It was my pleasure. And thanks to everyone for tuning in to Speak Dicely. My name is Teni Brant, and I hope to speak Dicely with you again soon. Bye-bye. The Speak Dicely podcast is produced by Teni Brant. The intro and outro music were created by Costin Brant. If you liked this content, be sure to subscribe to the Dicely D&D YouTube channel, and you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at DicelyDND. And if you want to submit a question to Question Dicely, send an email with your question to dicelychannel@gmail.com. Include the letters QD in your subject line and leave your name or username if you want a shout out. We'll see you next time on the Speak Dicely podcast.